So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Manuel Castedo, president of the Cuban Cultural Center of New York, and he'll say a few words about the center, and he'll also briefly introduce our speakers. So thank you.
Hi. On behalf of the Cuban Cultural Center of New York, I'd like to welcome you tonight to this very special event. As always, I would like to thank the American Society and Dan Shapiro, director of the literature program, with whom we have a very long and successful history over the years. Before introducing the main event, I'd like to mention that the Cuban Cultural Center of New York has been promoting Cuban and Cuban-American culture in New York for 16 years now. And after tonight's presentation, we invite you to take a copy of our spring calendar, which will be available. I also, we have an awful lot of events, but I want to especially call your attention to our Mega Cuban Art Auction event next Friday at the Spanish Benevolent Society, where we're going to be auctioning a lot of works, including some by such artists as Portocarrero, Bedia, and others. And the prices will be very competitive. It's very easy. You can register on the cubanculturalcenter.org website. If you're not a member, please consider joining the center, because it is the place to learn about Cuban culture in New York City. And it is very active, and we offer a very large number of events in all different areas. Anyway, we are very honored to have with us tonight two outstanding writers, Richard Blanco, our inaugural poet, winner of the 2006 PEN American Center Beyond Margins Award, and Gustavo Pérez Firmat, an essayist, novelist, and also a poet in his own right, who was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2004. As you can see in the program, these are tremendously accomplished individuals who have come here tonight to share with us their literary achievements. And for that, we thank them. Anyway, for now, let me leave you very proudly with Gustavo and Richard. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. And thank you, Dan. It's always great to come back to the American Society. And let me just, explain what we're going to do. I'll be serving as host tonight, so that we can get to know Richard and his work a little bit better. And then, at the end, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. And I thought I'd begin and break the ice by bringing up something that maybe I'm not sure if Richard wants me to bring up, but how I first became acquainted with his work. Back in the mid-1990s, there was a young group of Cuban Americans in Miami who began calling themselves Generation Ñ. For those of you who don't know Spanish yet, the Ñ is the N with the tilde. And it was sort of the Cuban-American version of Generation X or Generation Y, or somewhere between X and Y. And they also published a glossy magazine called Generation Ñ, which lasted for a number of years. And in the November 1996 issue, it was called the Azúcar issue, and it was featured Celia Cruz on the cover, and then it was full of sort of Cuban-American staple things like a list of Cuban-Americanisms such as embarkation, friqueado, and so on. There was a story about León Ichazo had just come out with a movie called Bitter Sugar. There's a story about that. There's a story about Cristina Salaregui, and of course the story about Celia Cruz. And then there's an article entitled, "What do you mean you don't know who Rick Blanco is?" Now, by now we all know who Rick Blanco is, except he's no longer Rick Blanco. He's now Richard Blanco. And I'll just read you a couple of, it includes, these sort of rapid-fire questions and answers. And so, what is your most Cuban characteristic? You said café. Your most American characteristic? You said patience. Your favorite Que Pasa USA episode is where the two abuelos get stoned. And your current celebrity crush, Patsy and Adina. Adina, I have no idea who those people are. So.
Absolutely fabulous.
And then, what makes you the happiest? My convertible. Do you still have a convertible?
No, not ever since I moved to Maine, no.
Okay. And then the last one is, which compact disc is in your stereo? And then you say you have 3, Shakira, Olita Adams, and Sting.
Yeah.
Are they still in your iPhone or whatever it is?
No, I'm listening more to James Taylor these days. You gotta show him the picture.
Yes, and this is great glam shot.
This was my
Of
20s.
Richard.
Which explains the...
And it's right across an ad for Generation Ñ magazines, con orgullo coño. And that applies also, of course, to our feelings about Rick Blanco. And at the time you were still working as a civil engineer,
Yeah.
right? And maybe we can begin by, you can talk a little bit how you went from building bridges to writing poems.
Oh, sure.
How did that happen?
Well, I mean, in that particular context, I was sort of the very early stages of sort of coming to writing, and like most, I think, Cuban-American exile families in Miami in those days, we were just, everybody was sort of sitting around going, what the hell do we do now? The business was about survival. It was about, creating, getting on your feet. And so though I was always had always a creative spirit and creative curiosity. I'm the one who played with Play-Dohs and Legos and was coloring and outlined all the things in my coloring books. The realm of the idea of doing something in the arts just wasn't, it just wasn't possible. It wasn't that my parents forced me to be an engineer or anything like that, but it just sort of happened. And then there was a cultural divide, right? Because even if we would have been talking about the arts around the dinner table, it would have been Jose Marti or whatnot, or Wilfredo Lam or whatnot. It wouldn't have been Robert Frost, and it wouldn't have been God, the pop artist.
Wallace Stevens.
Wallace Stevens, or any of the other painters. So there was a cultural divide too. So that sort of led me toward follow a more traditional role. And I was great at math. So I just kind of went along and like my parents, I did want to study architecture, and my parents were like, no, that's still too artsy. They're like, they weren't sure about that. And then they're like, they didn't even know I could have gotten maybe, scholarships or had really good grades. They're like, why don't you just go to FIU? It's right, it's only a mile away from the house. The ever practical immigrant, right? So I did that, and for years, I would think I was the only engineer in their program that actually took art gallery management as an elective. So there was always something that wanted to bud out, but I kept on. I didn't flunk out of physics 1 or 2 or 3 or calculus 1, 2, 3, or 4 either. And so I went on about my life, got a job as an engineering, again, sort of the typical work ethic of the immigrant. I already had a full-time job by the time I graduated. And then I'll never forget the day I was sitting in my parking lot. Now I'm like 23 with a full-time job, a degree, and I'm sitting in the parking garage, and I'm hearing a John Cougar Mellencamp and that little ditty about Jack and Diane, and something about the thrill. Is this the thrill of life? Is this it? And I just remember sitting there. Is that it? Is that all there is to life? Like, I'm 23. I'm an engineer, and I said, I'm going to do something. I'm going to explore something else in my life. And I got back in touch with those sort of creative feelings, and started painting and doing all sorts of things that I was terrible at. And in a weird way, it was engineering that was sort of a gateway to poetry, believe it or not. Because I realized I had to write there was so much writing involved in engineering. I mean, inch-thick reports, 3 or 4 page letters, proposals, and it started paying really close attention to language and seeing how language can be used to argue, to persuade, to create a persona. Our firm has been around for over 10 years. It had been 10 years and 3 weeks, but it was over 10 years. You know, we have done projects internationally because we did one project in Puerto Rico, who's a cousin of one of the principals. And you started seeing how you sculpt language and how you organize information. And it started really making me fall in love with language. And then I started sort of penning around, just penning poems, like doodling around with poems, and started slowly getting into it more. Took a creative writing course, and slowly I started being pulled into that direction. As they say, life is what happens in between the things you plan. And what was great about that was that it felt very natural, and there was no pressure involved in any of this. The pressure came later on after the first book was published. But slowly but surely, and I maintained both careers at the same time. I went to graduate school still as an engineer and working full-time as an engineer. So there wasn't really this sort of black and white sort of like shift, and I've always been hanging on to engineering, also sort of the plan B. Immigrants always have the plan B, right? On the very practical side. And even now, when all this has happened, it kind of scares me a little bit in a way, because I've never not done 2 or 3 things at the same time. And I have this left brain thing that I'm wondering if the left brain's gonna just start like getting really angry and start like trying to take over my creative side. So I've always found a balance, and that's why I've looked to poets like Wallace Stevens and William Carlos Williams a lot too, in terms of their careers as writers. And arguably, they're some of the most important American poets. Have always had other jobs in the 20th century, and I found that was a happy medium. I tried teaching for a while. And
when did you go up engineering altogether?
I haven't.
I mean, as a job. I mean.
I think it was January 21st. And actually not. My boss called me, I've known
So
since.
you're still working as an engineer?
I'm on the payroll still, yeah.
Oh, okay.
And my mother's like, make sure, she's like, acuérdate que your renewal for the license is due February 28th. So she's still like, she's like, it's all great, like Obama and all that, but make sure. And she sort of has a point. I mean, but it's my boss called me up and said, who's known me again since I was 15, and he said, all right, Rick. He's one of the ones that calls me Rick. It's like, what are you going to do with your left brain? And it's like, I don't know, Ramon, but don't call me for the next 6 months. I'm booked. So, but it's a little apprehensive because I've been so used to.
Your boss is Cuban?
What's that?
Your boss is Cuban?
Yeah, very Cuban. Gatella. Very Cuban Spanish. Yeah. So that's kind of been the journey, and of course the journey continues. It's something I look forward to. It's every poet's dream to be able to have this kind of platform, but it's also new territory, and it's also very, very exciting. But also, you have to navigate myself through it, and how do you become a full-time writer is something that most poets really very few have a concept of, because even teaching is another job. I mean, it requires its own talents and its own time and its own sort of its own nuances that are, even though you're teaching writing, it's not quite writing. So.
Do you find teaching helps your work, and the way that engineering helps your poetry, or you find it's a distraction, or you start writing poems as bad as the poems your students write?
I've heard that's often a complaint. I taught for 3 years. I liked the mentorship aspect of it, because believe it or not, I'm somewhat of an introvert. For a writer, surprise, surprise.
And for a Cuban.
For a Cuban. So I kind of liked the one-on-one with the kids, but it still scared the living daylights out of me to get up in front of a classroom. And I think it was partly because when I give everything I got. And so I found it a little draining. So I'd like to do smaller things or smaller programs. I like teaching like at 8-week courses and those kind of things. I didn't find, what happened was, you know, this little kid from Miami who just sort of was writing poems at lunchtime when got an MFA. Again, the practical thing was, I'm going to do this, I might as well get a degree in it so my mother can be happy. But all the while, it hadn't struck me that I was actually a poet. So all of a sudden, I went from engineering, I got the first book published, and now I'm a poet, teaching poetry, and that was a bit of a brain teaser, because then suddenly the pressure came in to say, you know, I was teaching all the great poems, and I was like, I started freaking myself out. I'm like, oh my God, I'll never be able to write like Elizabeth Bishop. You know, suddenly before it was like, Elizabeth Bishop. So in that way, it sort of messed with my mind a little bit, and then I found a happy medium somewhere along the line of it.
Okay. So why don't we talk about your poems a little bit, and then maybe you can read some. You have a lot of family poems, right? I mean, you have mother poems, father poems, brother poems,
grandma poems, and
a lot of interesting abuela poems. Yeah.
Abuelita poems.
Yeah, tia poems, right? And
I'm running out of family. And luckily with poetry, you can like sort of. We have a lot of tias and primos, of course, that aren't really related. So we just keep on adding, right? And primo so and so.
And so, can you talk about that? Because I know from reading your work that there's in some sense, your sense of family, your background feeds your poetry, but it's not an easy relationship always between, you know, where you come from and your family and your work as a poet.
Yeah, I'll read a little bit, and I'll finish that answer up here. But part of it is, as I think most of us in this room, and if not your children, is this on? Yeah. Yeah. You know, you grow up between two imaginary worlds, or two stories. You're born into this one story. You're born into the story of El Exilio. And so, especially in Miami, growing up in the 1970s, it was a very isolated, culturally isolated place. It still kind of is its own unique place. But it was the stories of los cuentos of, you know, in Cuba this and in Cuba that, and they tell you this story and this funny story and this bad sob story and the gossip and then the photos. And there was this great imaginary world, this paradise we were all going back to someday. And suddenly I didn't see anybody packing their bags anytime soon. And slowly you're like, okay, so where's this place exactly? And as a child, all this is happening subconsciously, right? You're not like aware of it. But there was another world that was subconsciously happening, was because of Miami was so insulated. I really thought in America, like the America that I saw on TV and in the reruns, especially the 1960s shows and the 70s shows, really existed. I really believed that was in America, that Miami was kind of a purgatory between the real Cuba, a cultural purgatory between the real imagined Cuba and the real imagined America. And even when I went to teach in Connecticut, I was still thinking I was going to do sleigh rides in the snow, and me and Martha Stewart were going to do arts and crafts. I don't know what else going on. I should have read that one. So what happened was the negotiation between those two worlds, and what it creates is it creates early on in life subconsciously these very big questions of what is home, where do I belong, how do you connect to place and actual physical landscapes. What is home? Why are my parents so enamored of this place? Why did I go at 22 searching for I Dream of Jeannie's house in Cocoa Beach on a trip? So anyway, so family is, and I feel odd sometimes even at this age, now that I'm almost 32. I was the youngest inaugural poet, that I still write about family, and it keeps on coming back. And part of it is because, well, that's just sort of this great big question that was never answered, and that's what makes art, right? It's those things that we can't quite answer, that we find different aspects to it, and we keep on exploring things. So even in this last book, I find myself going back to some of those family memories, and I realize it's just so ingrained. It's this endless well, and it's also a way of asking some very big questions. You know, always the lens of looking through family goes back to asking some of those. So it's a doorway into asking a lot of questions. So I'll read a couple and I've kind of separated it for myself in my work. There's kind of the poem that takes sort of more of the child's point of view, and it's sort of the child's voice. And then there's the poems that are sort of how that, as an adult now, has colored my perspective looking back at my life through the same lens of that sort of sense of exile and of loss that sort of just become to permeate my soul. Let me we'll read a funny one, because you can't be Cuban and not write a funny poem, right? So this was one of, and this is the latest book, and again, I thought I was done with all the family poems, and then I had this flashback of the Miss America pageant at my family's house, and it was just like this really big deal. Like, it was just like, and as a child, I was just going around like, what are these Cubans doing, like, so excited about the Miss America pageant? Shouldn't they be watching, like, El Rincón Criollo or something, some Spanish telenovela? And so it was a big deal. And I went back to it in this poem as a way of just exploring that and having a little fun with it and trying to understand what my sort of role was in that moment. It's called Betting on America. My grandmother was the bookie, La Bolitera. Set up at the kitchen table that night, her hair in curlers, pencil and pad jotting down $2 bets, paying 5-1 on which Miss would take the crown that year. Abuelo put his money on Miss Wyoming. She's got great teeth, he pronounced, as if complimenting a horse, not her smile filling the camera before she whiffed away into a cloud, like a cloud into her creamy chiffon dress. I dug up enough change from the sofa and car seats to bet on Miss Wisconsin, thinking I was as American as she because I was as blonde as she was, and I knew that's where all the cheese came from. That wasn't all. Chocolate was from Miss Pennsylvania, the capital of Miss Montana was Helena, Mount Rushmore was in Miss South Dakota, and I knew how to say Miss Connecticut. Unlike my tia Gloria, who just pointed at the TV, esa, that one, claiming she had her same figure before leaving Cuba. It's true, es verdad. I have pictures, she declared, before cramming another bocadito into her mouth. Papa refused to bet on any of the misses because Americanas don't have any butt, he complained. There's nothing like a big, and I have to do this, a big culo cubano. And even in the most Anglo crowd, you say that and everybody gets it. Everyone agreed. Es verdad, except for me and my little cousin Julito, who apparently was a breast man at age 5. Reaching for Miss Alabama's bosom on the screen, the leggy mulata sashaying in pumps, swimsuit, seducing Tio Pedro into picking her as a sure winner. She's the one. She looks Cubana, he swore. And she did, but she cost him $5. Cojones, he exploded as confetti rained, Bert Parks leading Miss Ohio, the new Miss America, by the hand to the runway. Gloves up to her elbows, velvet down to her feet, crying diamonds into her bouquet, the queen of our country, our land of the free, amid the purple mountains of her majesty, floating across the stage and our living room, though no one bet on her, and none of us, not even me, could answer Mama when she asked, Chico, ¿dónde está Ohio? And that's the same question I get when I moved to Maine. So, and I'll read this one, which is a poem I must have read 1,000 times already, and somehow I still like it. But I read this and I'd like to bookend it because in terms of family and how you connect with that, and I don't know if, you know, some of the generations here or some of your children, you know, people have this myth that you kind of, and I think there's a myth outside of Latino communities that you kind of grow up loving being Cuban, you know, like you just kind of like, you love this idea and like you know, you were always eating pork and fried rice and white rice and black beans, and you loved it. You didn't eat cheeseburgers, and in Mexican-American, that you always love your taquitos, you know, and all this stuff. And the truth is, as we all know, that anything that your parents represented was kind of immediate grounds for like, I'm not doing that. Los quinces, the food was like, again, you know, pork again, like can't we have lasagna or something like that? And it isn't until you reach a certain age where all this is sinking in subconsciously, and it isn't until a certain age, and that's what City of 100 Fires is basically. It's as a book is a coming of cultural age, and this was the very first poem that I read that I had to, the very first assignment in my very first creative writing class. And I was petrified. He was an engineer who hadn't written anything for 4 or 5 years. I mean, or at least in that kind of intense setting. And Campbell McGrath was my professor, and we read poems by Ginsberg, and we read poems by Frost, and we read poems by Whitman, of course. And my first assignment was, guess what? Write a poem about America. I was like, okay. So I was like, till this point, I was still writing about daffodils and spider webs, and I hadn't connected with that whole, who the hell am I? You know, that whole Cuban la búsqueda, that thing. So it was almost fate that this was this person, this professor. This was our first assignment, and the same assignment I would get, you know, 25 years later from Obama. But it sort of bookends my life right now, these 2 poems. And so I went home and I scratched my head. I'm like, all right. It was that moment where you realize what emotional truth is in a poem, and you're like, I can't fake this thing. Like, oh, America, and I went out in the field and picked tulips or whatever fiction I had in my head. And I said, well, this is what's coming out, and we'll put it out there. And it became the very first poem in the very first book. And it started me on this trajectory of sort of going back into family and going to almost like a reporter, like an emotional historian, an emotional historian, like going back and figuring out, oh, and that's why they did that. Oh, and that's why they did that. But this was the first poem that started it all. And of course, it's about Thanksgiving, which I don't think I need to explain any of the problems with Thanksgiving to this crowd. Although Tia Miriam boasted she discovered at least half a dozen uses for peanut butter, topping for guava shells and syrup, butter substitute for Cuban toast, hair conditioner and relaxer, Mama never knew what to make of the monthly 5-pound jars handed out by the immigration department until my friend Jeff mentioned a jelly. There was always pork, though. For every birthday and wedding, whole ones on Christmas and New Year's Eve, even on Thanksgiving Day. Pork, fried, broiled, or crispy skin roasted, as well as cauldrons of black beans, fried plantain chips, and yuca con mojito. These items required a special visit to Antonio's Mercado on the corner of 8th Street, where men in Guayaberas stood in Senate blaming Kennedy for everything. Ese hijo de puta. The bile, I don't think the White House read that line. The bile of Cuban coffee and cigar residue filling the creases of their wrinkled lips, clinging to one another's lies of lost wealth, ashamed and empty as hollow trees. By 7, I had grown suspicious. We were still here. Overheard conversations about returning had grown wistful and less frequent. I spoke English. My parents didn't. We didn't live in a 2-story house with a maid or a wood panel station wagon, nor vacation camping in Colorado. None of the girls had hair of gold. None of my brothers or cousins were named Greg, Peter, or Marcia. We were not the Brady Bunch. None of the black and white characters on Donna Reed or the Dick Van Dyke Show were named Guadalupe, Lázaro, or Mercedes. Patty Duke's family wasn't like us either. They didn't have pork on Thanksgiving. They ate turkey with cranberry sauce. They didn't have yuca, they had yams, like the diddles of pilgrims I colored in class. A week before Thanksgiving, I explained to my abuelita about the Indians and the Mayflower, how Lincoln set the slaves free. I explained to my parents about the Purple Mountain's majesty, one if by land, two if by sea, the cherry tree, the tea party, the amber waves of grain, the masses yearning to be free, liberty and justice for all, until finally they agreed, this Thanksgiving we would have turkey, as well as pork. Un pernil, you know, like. Abuela prepared the poor fowl as if committing an act of treason, faking her enthusiasm for my sake. Mama set a frozen pumpkin pie in the oven and prepared candied yams following instructions that I had to translate from the marshmallow bag. The table was arrayed with gladiolas. The plattered turkey loomed at the center on plastic silver from Woolworths. Everyone sat in green velvet chairs we had upholstered with clear vinyl, except Tio Carlos and Toti, seated in the folding chairs of the Salvation Army. I uttered a bilingual blessing, and the turkey was passed around like a game of Russian roulette. Dry, Gilberto complained, and proceeded to drown the lean slices with pork fat drippings and cranberry jelly, la mierda roja esa, as he called it. Faces fell when Mama presented her ochre pie. Pumpkin was a home remedy for ulcers, not a dessert. Tia Maria made 3 rounds of Cuban coffee. Then Abuelo and Pepe cleared the living room furniture, put on a Celia Cruz LP, and the entire family began to merengue over the linoleum of our apartment, sweating rum and coffee, until they remembered. It was 1970 and 46 degrees in America. After repositioning the furniture, an appropriate darkness filled the room. My Tio Berto was the last one to leave. Don't think. So family continues to be a big piece of it.
Since we have you up there, that,
Okay.
that poem is a 1970 poem.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
Just, but you were born in 68.
Well,
You
it's-
remember? Oh, okay.
There's these fictions that happen in portrait, but it was like this idea. I remember that since I was a little kid. That sense of like wanting this sort of great thing, this great American moment to happen, and it just would never happen. You know, it's like it always got messed up.
In the poem, you mentioned your dad and you mentioned your abuelita, and you know, people who read Latino literature know that abuelitas are stock characters in Latino literature. Every Latino
Right.
novel has an abuelita, and they tend to be sort of spiritual, kind-hearted, elderly ladies who talk to the saints, and
Right.
your abuelita was somewhat different.
Yeah,
Your abuelita was pretty fierce.
yeah.
The way could you read one
Sure,
of
however
your
you wanna. She was the.
abuela poems, like abuela's voices or queer, whichever one you
Yeah,
want.
she was the anti-abuelita. She was the, and the thing is, she was nice to everybody else, but everybody's like, everybody used to love my grandmother. She was like that to everybody else except to my family, to me and my brother and I. And, but this poem is, where this poem kind of developed is that my grandmother was as homophobic as she was xenophobic. So, like many of us, I imagine, but so that anything that was culturally weird was also queer. So things like Fruit Loops or, Play-Doh were like mariconerias, they were like, so she was very homophobic. But to say some saving grace on her behalf, the idea was, I think we all have a family member like that always sort of is the most well-intentioned, loving person, and in her case, I've come to understand that and made wonderful peace with her. And in a weird way, she made me a writer because of sort of the curveballs she threw me, made me sort of like stop and like become an observer of the world, because you never know what she was going to tell me. And so this poem was, at first I thought was a poem that I didn't want to publish because I thought it was too revealing, and I thought it's too angry and too scathing and too derogatory or whatnot. And then I read it the first time and people started laughing and then really laughing, and then I started laughing, and I realized I can't get back at her, I can't get even with her. But she's become a central figure. And I think part of it is what I'm dawning upon in this book is I had never really come out in my poetry in a way. There's this idea that the idea of cultural identity and that negotiation had sort of trumped the idea of sexuality or sexual identity, and I couldn't quite handle both at the same time. So in my second book, I still sort of purposely was gender neutral. I dedicated a lot of the queer poems to just initials, and it was in this book, and I always felt very guilty about it, but it was in this book that I finally found sort of the unique story that I wanted to tell, which was that clash between the cultural story that I had been telling and then the idea of sexuality and how that came together. So it's a sense of what's the cultural sexuality, because in some ways I always felt estranged in some degree from sort of the mainstream Anglo-gay culture as well. So and that was kind of bizarre. It was like this other negotiation that I had to go through. What is the queer story in my writing? And then here's my grandma. Queer theory, according to my grandmother. Some of this should just be in Spanish, but for this audience. This is obviously in her voice. Never drink soda with a straw. Men don't use straws. Milkshakes? Maybe. Stop buying your mother's Avon catalog and the men's underwear in those Sears flyers. I've seen you. Stay out of her Tupperware parties and perfume bottles. Don't let her kiss you. She kisses you much too much. Avoid hugging men, but if you must, pat them real hard on the back, even if it's your father. Must you keep that cat? Don't pet him so much. Ay, mijo, why don't you like dogs? Never play house, even if you're the husband. Quit hanging out with that Henry kid. He's too pale. And I don't care what you call them, those G.I. Joes of his are dolls. Don't draw rainbows or flowers or sunsets. I've seen you. Don't draw at all, no coloring books either. Put away your crayons, your Play-Doh, your Legos. Where are your Hot Wheels, your laser gun and handcuffs, those knives I gave you? Never fly a kite or roller skate, but light all the firecrackers you want, kill all the lizards you can, cut up worms, feed them to that cat of yours. Don't sit Indian style with your legs crossed, you're no Indio. Don't click-clack your sandals, you're no chorus girl. For God's sake, never pee sitting down. I've seen you. Never take a bubble bath or wash your hair with shampoo. Shampoo is for women. So is conditioner, so is mousse, so is hand lotion. Never file your nails or blow dry your hair. Go to the barber shop with your grandfather. You're not unisex, are you? Stay out of the kitchen. Los hombres don't cook, they eat. Eat anything you want, except deviled eggs, blow pops, croissants, bagels, maybe, cucumber sandwiches, and petite fours. Don't watch Bewitched or I Dream of Jeannie. Don't stare at the $6 million man. I've seen you. Never dance alone in your room. Donna Summer, Barry Manilow, the Captain Antonio, Bette Midler, and all musicals forbidden. Posters of kittens, Star Wars is apparently queer, Star Wars, or the Eiffel Tower forbidden. Those fancy books on architecture and art, I threw them in the trash. No, you can't wear cologne or puka shells, and I better not catch you in clogs. If I see you in a ponytail, it's coming off. Gay? What? No, you can't pierce your ear, left or right side. I don't care. You will not look like a goddamn queer. I've seen you, even though you are one. So that was my abuelita.
And when in English you render what she says as queer, what word would you have used in Spanish? Mariquita, marica. or
Mariquita,
something?
yeah, all the great ones.
But you wouldn't have said.
Mariconcito.
What?
Mariconcito. the term of endearment. But yeah, all those slurs were part of my childhood. So, in a weird way, it was kind of like I said, you make peace and you try to understand how everything in your life is sort of part of a great story, and it was because she made me so self-conscious in a way that I sat back and started observing, because I had to learn how to respond to my environment. And what do writers do except sit back and observe and see human nature? So in a weird way, it's kind of all come together. And so not to excuse homophobic behavior, because that's not what I'm trying to do, but it's I put her in a context in my life that made sense for me emotionally, and it's worked out. So I think the memoir she might be the star in my memoir. So
You're writing a memoir?
it's written, sort of.
You've written a memoir. Well, can we have a sneak peek? Or?
I don't have anything with me. Oh no, not the larger memoir. I do have. I have with me. I wrote a memoir about the inaugural process.
Okay.
That from sort of the minute I get the phone call to the minute I get on the plane and fly back home to Bethel, Connecticut, and I could read a little bit of that if you'd like. But
If you'd like.
yeah. Okay.
And you mentioned
That I got to dig up a little bit.
You mentioned that you have, since Richard became the inaugural poet, then he's been asked to write poetry for a bunch of different occasions. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I've been asked to. I mean, the whole concept of an occasional poem is. I've learned it's almost like its own genre, or subgenre of poetry. That it's like really it takes all these other sort of critical skills that you need to put together. And I don't know if it's because the inauguration or the people are conscious that it is an occasional poem, but I've been asked to write poems for. Right now for the Freedom to Marry organization, which is commemorating their 10th anniversary. I've been asked now to write a poem for I forget the exact name, but it's the International Fragrance Convention that's here in Lincoln Center in a few months. So a poem about perfume.
Are you gonna do it?
You know what? I'm really want to do it. Because it's like this sort of. So much after graduate school, they give you all these assignments, and then the rest of your life is spent trying to give yourself assignments. And I'm really curious, especially the perfume one, because I mean, I'm like a cologne freak. Like I don't know, like I guess a lot of Cuban men are like always perfumado, no? But I'm curious to learn about the history of perfume, and I know there's a whole other sort of world that has nothing to do with what I want to write about in the sense of the glitz and the glamour, but that sense of the history of scents is really something that's interesting me. What was another one that I think there was another one, now I forget. Well, the freedom to marry thing, that's obviously very close to my heart as a poem. There's another HBO thing that they want me to do about, I think, a Latino program. They want me to sort of use the poem as a narration through what they want to do. So it's really interesting. And I'm thinking someday there might be a book that'll just be occasional poems. you know, if I get enough of them. So,
So can you tell us a little about the whole experience of being, did you get a phone call, an email, or one day up in Maine telling you you had been selected as the
Yeah.
inaugural poet?
it was that easy, it was that simple and that mind-blowing. I'll read that piece if I can find it, like, because it kind of tells a little bit of what I went through. I got to sort through it a little bit, but why I decided to sort of put together this this memoir, which is pretty much done, is because the whole experience, outside of writing the poem and the pressures of all that, and there are some people in the room that were with me on that great journey, including my friend Nikki and my cousin Sergio and my speaker's agent and friend Allison, that can attest to this. I mean, you know, you think you're going to go read the poem, go back home, and there's this incredible journey that we all went through. I'll read you bits and pieces of it just as a prelude of what's going on. So this is shortly after I get the news. I'm actually driving to Bethel, Maine from New York. I had just spent some time in New York and had spent some time in Connecticut. And this is sort of what went through my mind, among other things, because this is a piece of it. In the rearview mirror becomes a portal into my past. In my reflection, I see my father holding my hand for the last time, quietly dying in the spare room of the house he'd raised me in. His eyes blinking forever once, goodbye, twice, forgive me, 3 times, I won't be back. I think of him, my mother, my grandparents, their courage and sacrifices, all their struggles and hard work to make a better life in America for themselves and for my brother and me. Overcome by an immense sense of gratitude, I pull off the highway, step out of the car and sit on the shoulder. Looking into the sky, the sun becomes a sunflower. This is because of them, I keep thinking, repeating, all because of them, all because of them. Every story begins inside a story that's already begun by others. Long before we take our first breath, there's a plot well underway with characters, a setting, a plot we did not choose, but was chosen for us. My story as inaugural poet began with that phone call, literally, but figuratively, it began a long, long time ago in another story about a great journey that began with tears and loss, a journey that would end with hope and triumph. 1968. My parents summon every bit of courage they have and decide to emigrate from Cuba, exiling themselves from the only country they had ever known, uncertain if they'd ever again walk into the homes where they were born, or sit in the town square where they courted each other, or share a cafecito with their lifelong neighbors. So that sort of was, which surprised me, was sort of that first sort of the idea of like, that you just come from this long, that, you know, we think, and especially sort of in your 20s and 30s, we think that, well, I decided to be a civil engineer, or I decided to move to Connecticut, or I decided to do that, and that our lives, right, are this thing that we've controlled, that it's been based on our decisions, and that's not entirely untrue. But the idea that there's so much that's decided the minute you are born, that there's so much context around you, there's so much story already born, and you're really just a character that's coming in and on stage, you know, in the 5th act. And that recognition was for me very powerful, because it is part also, you know, tangential to the American dream. And it's like, you know, you hear these stories, and it's like where I think where my grandmother came from, who was 6th grade education, To me, standing in front of that audience and reading a poem for America, that's amazing. And that only happens, or I don't want to say only, but that is truly an American story, and that the great immigrant or exile story is America itself. And till that very moment, and as I went through the process of asking a lot of questions to write the 3 poems, you know,
3 poems?
3 poems. I had to write, I don't know if to me it's common knowledge already, but I had to write 3 poems. I had to submit 3 poems for consideration, brand new poems, in 3 weeks. The most important poem of my life, arguably. And it was like, okay, here we go. But at first I was a little cocky, actually, because of that first assignment, right? So I was like, oh, I've been writing about America for years. It'll be a cinch. And then I got down to the nitty-gritty, and I was like, well, I've been writing about an America that's a very sort of autobiographically based America, and this is somewhat of a, well, not somewhat, is a very different assignment. But what all this process sort of made me go through, and I thought I had answered more or less those questions. I'm Cuban-American, I'm this and that, my parents were story, I had him working on my little poems, 3rd book. I had it, I thought I had my sort of creative life sort of in check, and I thought, well, the next project will be the memoir of growing up in Miami and that kind of stuff. And I hadn't expected this other journey and all these emotional things to come into play. Because there was still a part of me, I discovered, a very small part, but not an insignificant one, that said, Richard, you're not American. Not really. There was still some part of me that said, America is still some other little boy with a shiny bike that, that rides to school and whose mother cooks dinner with pearl chokers and in pumps and is always making turkey. And even at 32, I was still sort of, I thought I was over that. And it was kind of like I've gone about my life sort of in a more or less like an exile mode. Not as probably as badly as my parents, but in the sense that desterrado in a weird way. I just felt like, yeah, I'm American, but, and like, yeah, I'm Cuban, but, there's this sort of just floating around like I was on vacation waiting for someone to tell me your flight is ready to board to go home. Wherever that was, I didn't know. So one of the most important questions I had to ask myself was that very nature of who I am. Where do my loyalties at the end of the day end or land? And this was part of it. Do I love America? Do I love America? That was the question that eventually yielded the first draft of One Today. My initial answer was simply the spirit of its people. And I began writing the poem on that impulse, trusting it and what the creative process would lead me to discover something magical, I hoped. Much of the creative process happens unconsciously. I'm always amazed by how my poems mirror our unconscious feelings and premeditate our understanding of ourselves. How they always seem to teach me something about myself and my world that I hadn't consciously acknowledged. How it does that for the readers at times as well. During the revision process, I took a microscopic look at the poem. I began to uncover the many conscious and subconscious experiences, past and present, that influenced and informs the poem's images, themes, and contracts. Most significantly, I discovered that One Today's central message harkened back to that story I was born into, that tight-knit community of Cuban exiles in which I grew up had instilled in me a deep, strong sense of unity, dignity, and respect for one another. My brother and I would spend almost every weekend with parents haciendo visitas, visiting relatives and old friends from Cuba, especially the elderly or the less fortunate than us. My mother would show up with a homemade flan, or a home-sewn blouse. Sometimes a garbage bag full of secondhand clothes my brother and I had outgrown. And sometimes just a can of Cuban coffee she had found on sale. My father would bring his toolbox ready to replace anything, a leaky faucet, install a new door lock, or fix a broken chair for an old Dio. And there were those who helped us. When we emigrated from Spain to New York City, my tia Olga and tio Armando had already set up an apartment for us in their building with 2 months' rent paid and a job for my father working at a bomb factory. 3 months and 4 days after we arrived in the United States, my father wrote a letter in his poor English thanking the City of New York Social Services Department for their help and letting them know we would no longer be needing assistance. I stole that letter from my mother's keepsake box. It's now one of my treasures. Every now and then, when I'm organizing my office or closet, I rifle through it looking for something I've lost, and what I find is his courage again. And I'm going to skip forward to, I think it's the very end. So I'm sitting up there, right, with my mother. Niño, estate quieto. She's like, telling me to stop fidgeting. She's like, que flaca la Joe Biden esa. She's like, mothers, right? She's still a mother. She's sitting there, like next to the, hands distance from the president. She's still a mother, but so we're going through this whole sort of typical mother and son thing, even at this moment, which I thought was beautiful. But here I am at the platform, and this was for me what crystallized what everything had come to, the writing the poem, the experiences, bringing my mother sitting next to me. Everything sort of coalesced to this point. In that moment, I feel America standing as one, putting differences aside and taking a deep collective breath. We pay tribute to something far bigger and more important than any one of us. I truly feel I am one of us, one of we the people, in the echoes of Obama's speech. I embrace America in a way I never had, feeling for the first time that I belonged, truly belonged, to one country. Not an imaginary ideal from TV or a nostalgic island floating in the sea of my parents' memories, but a real, tangible place that is mine, was mine all along. I turn to my mother and whisper, "Mama, I think I'm finally an Americano." Indeed, I realize it was always one story I was born into, one story for me to discover and claim, one story to make my own. At that moment, I understand one today as my gift to America. Senator Schumer introduces me and calls me up to the podium. My mother squeezes my shoulder. I stand more confident than I imagined I would be, transfixed by the moment, which is no longer about me or my poem or my glory, but about our America. Still, I'm surprised when the president and vice president stand up to greet me and shake my hand on the way up to the podium. They both whisper something in my ear that I can't make out. Too nervous. But their gestures, their gracious gestures, speak silently to my heart as if they were saying, "Here is your country. This is your story." I step up to the podium, look out over the crowd, a quilt of lives, of stories spread across our ground, under our sky, beneath our one sun. I take it all in as I take one deep breath and then another. This is for them. This is for all of us, I think to myself. And I begin speaking into our wind. Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, America. So that was my...
That's
I could read the poem. Tell me more.
That was great, thank you. I think why don't we open the discussion up to the audience, so.
We're all good.
Jose
Namaste.
has a microphone. Just raise your hand or stand up or wave. There's a back there?
Hi. Do you have any advice for someone getting started as a poet, getting started as a writer, getting out there, just expressing yourself to the general public instead of just writing for yourself?
Sure, I got. I'm gonna ask a Cuban for advice here. I'm gonna say, you know, I can't read It's a question we get asked a lot in different forms. I think Gustavo would agree, and I think you should chime in as well in this one. But for me personally,
My answer would be don't do it.
Don't do it. Stop now. I think from what I've seen, that is something that's not taught in class, is what you need to learn. Not that you don't need to learn what's taught in class, but in writing programs. For me, it was, and maybe it was just sheer luck, but it was writing that first poem, that America poem. There has to be something that a poem, you have to have something to say that comes from within. And the craft, you practice the craft, you polish the craft, and yes, that that is obviously it's redundant to say that that's important, but that's the other pieces of writing that nobody can sort of teach you, and it's not something you can actually grab either. It's something you just have to sort of have your eyes open to, and I forget if this is Lorca or not, but that idea of throwing your heart on the bull's horns, that's a poem. And that means you are at that moment just giving everything you have, and whether that kind of, because you need to say it, and by say it I don't mean in the political context either. I mean that sense where that deep part of where art comes from, and I find that makes a difference, and it makes writing easier in a way because it helps you decide what poems to write. It helps you decide how to edit poems. It helps you to decide how to write books of poetry, how to put things together. And what I find a lot from when I've taught in schools and stuff, and again, they are younger kids, but it's that there's a lot of writing going on, but it's what are you trying to say? And so always keep your eyes and your ears open to yourself to say, what is that thing that I can't answer, that thing that obsesses me but I have no answer for, and I probably will never have an answer for the rest of my life. That's what you write about in a way. And like I said, I'm still in the third book, still going what were the crazy Cubans doing watching that? It's like endless. It's not that and the question takes on new dimensions, right? So, and maybe I'll read a poem of something sort of a little more articulate, a little bit more later on the adult perspective, but that to me is a core essential of what keeps you going, because ultimately it's this selfish endeavor of I need to find out this for myself, and that really is a strong impetus, like a sort of strong impulse that I think carries writers a long way. And again, without aiming to say that craft and reading other writers and all that all adds to that, to those ahas that you might have along the way. And write with a pencil.
Could you elaborate a little bit when you said that every time you start to write a poem, you go through a
Could you stand up, sir?
Could you elaborate a little more about what you said earlier, how when you start writing, you go through a discovery process and how the creative process helps you gain a better understanding of yourself or a topic or an emotion?
Oh, sure, yeah. Sure failure for a poem, for me, is like when I sit down to a poem and I'm convinced I know what this poem is about. I'm convinced that I know exactly what the emotional center of this poem is, and I know exactly what I feel about it, and sure enough, that becomes a fail. That poem usually ends up giving me a lot of headaches, because to me, a poem, again, as you sit down when you have a question, when something you can't answer, and I think in the process, what I often discover is that often what I end up really feeling about something is completely the opposite of what I started writing with. And it's that process of pulling at yourself and tearing yourself apart to really get at the core emotional truth of what you are. And I find that makes for the best poems, those poems of discovery, those poems that sort of, that you're discovering yourself as the next word is written. And it's just amazing how that can happen. And then the revision process becomes a part of sort of that's the first explosion. And the revision process becomes a lot easier because you have that raw data on the paper. Is that kind of what you're asking, or slightly different? Yeah. Every poem happens a little bit differently. Also, I don't like general rules either. For me, there are those poems that just come in 5-10 minutes. But it doesn't mean I haven't been working on them for 5 or 10 years up here, because there's been work going on. And so I just didn't, I like to say I started those poems at the right time. And then there's poems that I started at the wrong time that take 5 or 10 years to finally find out where they are. To give you an example, and I'll just read this poem. Are we doing good on time here?
Yeah, I think we're doing fine.
Which kind of is related, a little bit of what I said earlier about that first phase of understanding that childhood voice that I think I read 2 poems. That was sort of the initial phase that I still go back to a lot. But this was a poem called "Looking for the Gulf Motel," which is the title poem of the book. And I took my partner Mark to Marco Island, wanting to take a trip down memory lane and sort of show him where I used to go as a kid. And so it was the poor man's vacation. We'd rent, for a week at a cheap hotel in July when the rates were cheap. And I wanted to sort of give him that part of me, that share my memory. Of course, what I found was that the place had completely changed and it had been erased from the landscape. And I wrote this really, really angry poem, in which I sounded like my parents when they were like on those nostalgic rants of like, can you believe que pintaron la casa de Julia en verde? That they would be like, oh my God, they painted so and so's house blue in Cuba. It used to be yellow. How dare they? And that's Cuba, which not much has changed in terms of the houses are still there. I mean, Marco Island was completely unrecognizable. And I suddenly found out, again as an adult, that South Florida had become my Cuba home in a weird way. It was a city that's changed so much. But I want to say that, and also that I just threw away the entire poem and kept one line, which is the line that repeats in here, because it wasn't, I sat down convinced, this is a poem about complaining, how dare they change the thing. And it really was not, it was really about sort of recognizing that in some ways we're all pawns of history, and you have to sort of embrace that in some way. And however sad that feels, in some ways there's things beyond your control. Looking for the Gulf Motel. There should be nothing here I don't remember. The Gulf Motel with mermaid lampposts and ship's wheel in the lobby should still be rising out of the sand like a cake decoration. My brother and I should still be pretending we don't know our parents, embarrassing us, as they roll the luggage cart past the front desk, loaded with our scruffy suitcases, 24 loaves of Cuban bread, brown bags bulging with enough mangoes to last the entire week, our espresso pot, the pressure cooker, and a pork roast reeking garlic through the marble lobby. All because, mijo, we can't afford to eat out, not even on vacation. Only 2 hours from our home in Miami, but far enough away to be thrilled by the wider sands on the west coast of Florida, where I should still be for the first time watching the sun set instead of rise over the ocean. There should be nothing here I don't remember. My mother should still be in the kitchenette of the Golf Motel, her daisy sandals from Kmart squeaking across the linoleum, still gorgeous in her teal swimsuit and amber earrings, stirring a pot of arroz con pollo, adding sprinkles of onion powder and dollops of tomato sauce. My father should still be in his terry cloth jacket, smoking, clinking a glass of whiskey in the sunset at the Golf Motel, watching us dive into the pool, 2 boys he'll never see grow into men who will be proud of him. There should be nothing here I don't remember. My brother and I should still be playing parcheesi. My father should still be alive, slow dancing with my mother on the sliding glass balcony of the Golf Motel. No music, only the waves keeping time, a song only their minds hear 10,000 nights back to their life in Cuba. My mother's face should still be resting against his bare chest, like the moon resting on the sea. The stars should still be turning around them. There should be nothing here I don't remember. My brother should still be 13, sneaking rum in the bathroom, sculpting naked women from sand, and I should still be 8 years old, dazzled by seashells and how many seconds I can hold my breath underwater. But I'm not. I'm 38, driving up Collier Boulevard, looking for the Golf Motel, for everything that should still be, but isn't. I want to blame the condos, their shadows for ruining the beach and my past. I want to chase the snowbirds away with their tacky McMansions and yachts. I want to turn the golf courses back into mangroves. I want to find the Golf Motel exactly as it was and pretend for just a moment that nothing I've lost is lost. So that sense of how I become my parents, so it's not no longer sort of the childhood thing, but that, again, and the idea that question that I asked 12 years ago somehow is still coloring my life. It's still informing that. I forget who was the famous poet that said, you're writing the same poem all your life in some way, which is in a way true, so. A question? Oh, we have the microphone back there.
I wanted to ask a little bit about your process and what other arts you look to when you get stuck or when you write yourself into a corner. What are the other artists or forms that inspire you and inspire your work?
I have several poems and favorites, like Elizabeth Bishop, Robert Haas, Pablo Neruda, those kind of Adam Zajewski, which I can never pronounce. New favorites like Rachel McKibben's. I'm really, really getting into the school that comes from the spoken word element. I think they are an amazing force in America that is so grown up and so underappreciated right now. I mean, some of these authors are like amazing, and they're back to the troubadours, and so I listen to them and go see them perform. As far as other things, there's always a Celia Cruz or Arbita would throw me into. I love listening to music. And doing a little salsa around the house, or so that always seems to break me out of a funk. I don't know that I do anything too methodical, except I'm one of those writers that ferments a lot. and just sort of collects information and collects images. And you know, there's this old adage that I get kind of a little sick and tired of, and a lot of professors will hate me for saying this, but that whole writers write every day. But they don't qualify that. Some people have to work 10, 12 hours a day and have kids. But the idea of writing every day to me is paying attention to the world. So that it's like, that is writing. Like if you're noticing, you know, like, especially in New York, there's a lot to notice. You know, if you're noticing, you know, I'm in the middle of Koreatown right now, which is like this feast for the eyes, right? And noticing those subtleties of life, and noticing noticing the way people respond, or what they're saying, or how they speak, or how, or remembering things, and staying on that for a while of something that you've always remembered. That's writing, and so I don't have that method of, I sit down and look at the blank screen. Usually when I sit down, it's because I can't take it anymore. And I'm like, doesn't mean the poem comes all at once, but I go through a different sort of fermentation process. And the truth, if you want to know, is that's my way. That's not your way, that's not his way. That everybody has to find what works for them, because we're all unique individuals. So it's great to ask these questions, but it's also paying attention to yourself and what works for you. I mean, sometimes for me, it's just as simple as when I wrote the inaugural poem, I had to physically change locations. I had to write it at the dinner table. I just had to change from my office because so much other stuff was in the office. So even like changing, going to the cafe or Starbucks or whatnot, you know, for one day, not go to Starbucks. No, I go to Starbucks, and that works for me, because, you know, art has to be constantly challenged. That's the other thing. So you might write a journal for a few years, but then maybe you want to start recording things and hearing your voice. I don't know. I'm going on and on with the question, but I'm sharing with you, the bottom line is I'm sharing you sort of how I work and how those inspirations and how I sort of break myself out of things, but it's what works for me. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question.
Oh, sure.
Since October 2012, the Obama administration has eased restrictions on travel back to Cuba, and it reintroduced the people-to-people license. And I'm just wondering, how do you feel about returning to your homeland if you have not yet done so?
Yeah, and they eased what? I'm sorry,
They've eased, the administration eased travel restrictions on Cuban-Americans returning, and also reintroduced the people-to-people licenses that enable U.S. Americans to travel legally to Cuba.
Oh, I got one on me. I've been busy. That's, you know, without getting into the hot button issue of embargo or no embargo or whatnot, I've gone to Cuba several times. I try to do it with dignity. I try to do it out of, I had to see my family, that whole side of my mother's family that was about like 80 people that the second part of the first book is all about my first trip to Cuba. I think it's, I mean, in a weird way, I still have these little daydreams of someday having a place in Cuba and retiring in Cuba, or, you know, even through all this, you know, there's still that little piece of history, of your history, that you want to hold on to. And I think the more exchange there is at a human-to-human level is actually more powerful than any sort of commercial element. I think that creates really strong bonds. I know that in my conversations with my cousins throughout the years and all this stuff, they have learned a lot about America. I have learned a lot about Cuba, and have educated myself to be able to speak more intelligently, because there's nothing, again, like knowing, or at least walking in somebody's shoes, or at least walking next to them while you see them walking in those shoes. And so I love the idea of there being more exchange in general. I think it's I don't know where the embargo, where the Cuban, my experience, and I'll show you this, we really thought that with my home being nominated that there's going to be this explosion of, you know, the hot button issue of the embargo and Cuba and all this, and Miami was going to be, God knows what they were going to ask me or ask me to say. And there was none of that, which is really interesting because it was either something was grander or something has changed or something was grander. Maybe the pride in having a Cuban-American son read and represent them was greater than that. But yeah, in general, I mean, I think as my generation, we grow up with sort of both straddling those two sides of the story, and you know, the sort of the myth and the reality, and if anything, I would like to be, I think at some point, not as a political, not as sort of a political agent, but as history plays itself out, if there is eventually some communication, I would like to be some kind of healer in a way, some kind of trying to understand, bridging the generations and trying to understand. It's like, kind of reminds me of that game show, will the real so-and-so stand up? And like, I think we're gonna might have that question sometime in my life. Will the real Cubans stand up? Because there's these, even in Miami, I've had a lot of my cousins have come over, and I think this is a Miami-ism, but to be able to distinguish, like, you know, because it's no longer Marielito, or, you know, so now the new generation of, like, may have come 5, 6, 8, 10 years ago, we call them the cubes. So that it's not a derogatory thing. It's just sort of like, because now I have like two sets of family, right? So there's my Cuban-American cousins that have my similar experience, and then there's my Cuban cousins, and when they get together, it's a hoot, because it's amazing, and you start sort of reliving sort of how they're negotiating their lives, and you try to help them, and you try to tell them this, and you try to teach them about how you got to pay taxes and all this kind of stuff, and it's just amazing to watch. Eventually, they start stitching themselves together a little bit more as they learn English, and as the Cuban Americans learn a little more Spanish, and it's a beautiful thing to watch, because it's form of that unification is happening at a family level, in a very benevolent and beautiful way that sort of sans politics, but it's just really funny. It's like I have to like switch between, like, and, you know, it's like going to, you know, when I switch going to Cuba, it's like their experiences are so different, and yet we embrace each other for obvious reasons. Cubanos, you know, and Americans, actually. That's the important part too. Oh.
Okay, I think we'll end the formal event at this point, but you know, Richard will be happy to continue to talk to you informally. And I just want to thank
Thank you,
Richard again for his warm.
And I'd like to thank Richard and Gustavo for moderating. And thanks to all of you for attending. We're really happy to see such a big crowd. We have copies of Richard's books, I believe all three of your collections, and copies of Gustavo's books. Please buy them. They're for sale at through Casa Azul bookstore, right at the table outside. And our next event in literature will be taking a couple of weeks break. Will be May 15th to 17th. We're having our iconic and emerging Latin American writers symposium, which will culminate in the launch of Review 86. So hope to see you all there. We have information about that activity, and also our other activities in culture. Don't make sure to see the exhibition when you get a chance downstairs, the Schul Solar and Borges. Thank you.